Hey everyone, welcome back to Retirement Planning Simplified. I am Joe Curry, and today we're going to dive into one of the most talked about topics in retirement planning, the 4% rule. So, if you've done any kind of research on retirement income planning, sustainable withdrawal strategies, in other words, how much can you take out of your portfolio without running out of money, you've no doubt heard of the 4% rule. It is often the go to rule of thumb. It's simple, it's easy to understand, but is it right for you? So today we're going to dive into exactly what is the 4% rule and how it works. And we're going to look at some alternative strategies that might be a better fit for you. Let's get started. Okay, so what is the 4% rule? Simply put, it is a formula for how much you can take out of your portfolio in retirement and not run out of money over a 30-year period. So to give you an example, if you had $1 million in your retirement portfolio when you retired, the 4% rule says you would start by taking $40,000 in withdrawals from your portfolio. So that's 4% of $1 million. And that would be your income for year one. In year two, you would simply increase $40,000 in this scenario by whatever inflation was for the past year. So if the cost of living increased by 3% last year, this year, your income or your withdrawal for the year would be $40,000 plus another 3% of that $40,000. And you would just do that every year in retirement. So it keeps your spending stable. So as the cost of living rises, your income goes up with it. So you're not having to make any adjustments to your income as you go. Now, this came about in the 90s by a guy, a rocket scientist by the name of Bill Bengen. And he just did a lot of research, kind of back testing the data around, how much money can you take, and even through the worst times, not have to worry about running out of money over the typical 30-year retirement. So let's talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages of the 4% rule. All right, so let's start with the advantages, and I kind of already touched on this, but it gives you a predictable retirement income. So again, you're not having to adjust up and down every year, just depending on how your portfolio went. It's kind of set it and forget it. Like there's just that one calculation each year. How much did the cost of living go up? That's how much you're going to withdraw in addition to your original $40,000 in the scenario I gave. Again, that $40,000 is based on $1 million portfolio. That's 4%. It's easy to understand, right? Sometimes there's value in simplicity, right? We talk here about retirement planning simplified. Doesn't matter how good your strategy is. If you don't understand it, it makes it a lot more difficult to implement and continue to follow that strategy. But there are some disadvantages, actually a lot of probably disadvantages to the 4% rule. So one is that there's no flexibility. So I don't know about you, but I know a lot of our clients, they want to spend more money early in retirement when they have their, mobility, they have energy, so they want to get out, they want to travel, they want to spend money on their grandkids. So those early years in retirement is where we typically want to spend the most money. But the 4% rule is just even spending over your retirement. Additionally, there's nothing to say that the 4% rule is bulletproof. Based on that back tested data in the 90s, it worked out for sure. But that said, we don't know what markets are going to bring into the future, right? So there's no real plan for how do you know when your portfolio is not done well enough and you actually need to tighten the belt a bit and back off, right? There's no rule for when you make that adjustment. So there's some risk there. Additionally, you may have the goal of spending as much as you can in retirement. And so with the 4% rule, I mentioned there's some risk that maybe markets are worse in the future than they have been in the past. But the flip side of that is in most scenarios, the whole idea behind the 4% rule is that even in the worst we've seen, you're not going to run out of money. But what that means is that in all scenarios outside the worst, you're leaving money on the table. You could have spent more money. So if your goal is to maximize your retirement spending, especially early on in retirement, then the 4% rule is probably not ideal for you. So let's look at some other strategies. So the first alternative is another, we'll call it maybe classic retirement income strategy. And really, it's a bit more how you're setting up your portfolio. So we could call this a time segmentation strategy or a bucket strategy. And so the idea here is that you would line up your portfolio to match your expected spending. So in other words, whatever you're going to spend over the next couple of years, you're going to have something that's liquid, easy to get your hands on, and also isn't exposed to market risk. So that might be something as simple as high interest savings as an example. And then you have your, we'll call it more kind of medium term bucket. where this could be spending over the next 3 to 5, 3 to 9 years, just depending on your comfort level. And you might have something built in here, maybe with some guarantees like GICs, or maybe you're looking at low risk bonds. But the idea, again, is you're not taking a lot of risk here because this is still relatively short term spending. And then beyond that, you might have your growth bucket or your long term bucket. And then that's where you're more likely to have your more traditional stock portfolio, something along those lines. Again, these are just examples, not advice, but that's what a typical time segmentation or bucket strategy might look like. And you would just replenish those short term buckets as you spend down that money. So you're continuing to have that short term bucket there. Now, of course, we still need to figure, well, how much can you spend in your first year, second year, and so on. So that's where some projections, the more traditional projections, are probably going to come in handy based on how your comfort level is with how many years of spending you have in those buckets is going to give you an idea of how much you can spend each year. Your financial planning software may also run what we might call Monte Carlo scenarios, where we're looking at different scenarios and seeing how they play out to let you know what is a safe amount you can take out of that time segmentation or bucket strategy. So another strategy that could work well if you're someone who maybe has some legacy goals, so you want to leave money to the next generation, you have some causes, charities that you want to make sure you're leaving kind of a legacy benefit to. You still might want to play it somewhat conservative because you want to make sure that there's money left over at the end of the day. The flip side is, though, unlike the 4% rule, you want to know that if things are going well enough, if you've done well, you've made some good progress throughout your retirement, you also know when you can take more out of the portfolio. Again, still leaving that nest egg there for the next generation. So we call this the Ratchet strategy. So you're going to start with some percentage that's going to be very conservative. So it might only be 3% as opposed to the 4% rule. It might be 4%. 4% could still work here. And it's partly going to depend on your goals, your resources, and how much income you need, right? So let's just say we started that at 3%. So on the $1 million portfolio, you started at 3% withdrawal, meaning $30,000 a year. And just like the 4% rule, you would increase that number with inflation each year. So as the cost of living goes up, you increase that 3%. So it's 3%, the initial number, plus inflation each year. Now, where this differs from the 4% rule is that if the portfolio from where it starts gets to a point where it's 50% larger, so that $1 million portfolio, if several years into retirement and following that strategy of taking 3% plus inflation out, all of a sudden the portfolio is $1.5 million because you got lucky, you retired at the right time, you timed the market's perfect. So in that scenario, once you've got that additional 50% of the portfolio, you're safe to increase what you're taking out on top of the inflation by an additional 10%. And then 3 years down the road, if you're still 50% above that starting portfolio value, you bump it up by 10% again. Just a reminder, you're still having those inflation increases along the way, so you're not having to drop your purchasing power over time. So this is a good strategy if you want to make sure there's a minimum amount left for the next generation or, again, charities, whatever it is. But on the same hand, you want to enjoy more if you've made it so that for sure is going to happen. Now, one of our favorites you might have heard me talk about in the past is Guardrails, or dynamic withdrawal strategies. Now, the Ratchet strategy is a version of this. So we really like the Guardrails because what it does, unlike the Ratchet strategy, is it allows us to take more money out in those early years. Because what we do is we put some guardrails around your portfolio withdrawals. So we have that upper guardrail, and where the portfolio, if it hits the upper guardrail, just like with the Ratchet strategy, we say, okay, look, you can bump up that spending by 10%. So we still have that in place where we know we can spend more if we retired at a really good time and our portfolio has grown. The flip side, though, is because we're taking more money out at the start, there's a chance that if we don't get a good sequence of returns, we're going to be spending down the portfolio a bit too quickly. And so this is where the lower guardrail comes into play. And the lower guardrail is the exact opposite of that upper guardrail or the Ratchet strategy where we increase by 10%. Is if we hit our lower guardrail, we actually decrease our withdrawals by 10%. Now, you don't necessarily have to do that right away as soon as you pass the lower guardrail. Typically, we would give it 6 months to a year with clients and say, okay, look, we're meeting today, maybe a month or two, we're below the lower guardrail. We're going to meet again in 6 months. If it's still below that lower guardrail, then we need to make that adjustment to your spending or your withdrawals just to make sure that the portfolio doesn't go down too far while you're taking money out of it, locking in some losses, and then eventually causing you to run out of money. Because, of course, we don't want that to happen either. But if we look at the 4% rule versus the guardrails, we might be able to take an extra 25% or maybe even more out on that initial withdrawal. So as an example, if you're taking 4% out, if you follow the 4% rule, well, you might be able to actually take out 5% if you follow the guardrails. Now, Joe, you just said 25%, but we just went from 4 to 5. How does that make sense? Well, we're talking in the amount of the increase. So it's not a 1% increase. If you think about it, I'm going to go back to that $1 million portfolio. If you have $1 million, you're taking 40,000, which is 4% out on the 4% rule. If you are taking 5% out, now you're taking $50,000 out a year as your starting amount, right? And the reason this is so powerful is it's a good chunk of additional income early in retirement that could be spent on travel, as an example. There's $10,000 a year for travel that you wouldn't have if you're using the 4% rule. But we also have a plan for, what if we hit the lower guardrail? And if we do hit the lower guardrail, we're making a 10% adjustment downwards in our withdrawals. And that really just takes you down in the scenario I just gave you from 50,000 to 45,000. And you're still above that lower guardrail, still spending more money early on in retirement than if you were following the 4% rule. So I could do an entire episode on all the details of where to go with your guardrails. Guyton Klinger, if you search that, you'll find some information on it. But at the end of the day, this is a dynamic withdrawal strategy that helps you maximize spending early in retirement, but puts a plan in place for when you can spend more and when you need to dial it back. If markets just scare you and you're not comfortable with any of this at all, there's other options. So we could look at a guaranteed income strategy or income protection. You might be lucky enough that you have a defined benefit pension where you're getting a guaranteed paycheck for life. So that would be, fall into that income protection piece. Government benefits to an extent will fill in there. But if those aren't enough to meet your basic expenses, then you might want to add more money to that income protection piece so that you know that at least all your kind of minimum costs are covered throughout retirement and you don't have to worry about market risk. So how would you do that? In simplest terms, you would just give money to an insurance company, and in return, they would give you a guaranteed income for life. And we would call that an annuity. So where do we start with all of this? How do you know, what one's right for you? The first thing really I tell everybody is you want to figure out what's your retirement income style. And we can do that through the RISA, Retirement Income Style Assessment, and then info@retirementplanningsimplified.ca. If you shoot us an email, we can shoot out a link that will help you determine your retirement income style. But once you figure that retirement income style, you're going to have a better idea, based on your comfort level, your goals. Does that traditional total return portfolio make sense for you, which is a good fit for the guardrails or the 4% rule? Or are you, more concerned about having those buckets and seeing exactly how things line up for your spending over time, in which case you might be falling into this time segmentation, retirement income style, or maybe, again, if you just need to have some guarantees in place, maybe you're more income protection. And then there's one other quadrant as well. But the main thing here is just understanding what is going to work with you. Because if you pick the wrong strategy, no matter how good that strategy is, if it blows up, your retirement is not going to be as successful as it otherwise could have been, just picking the right plan or right strategy for you. Look, obviously, there's a lot of variables here to help you determine this planning. So this is where a financial advisor really can be helpful. If you want my team and I to help out, feel free to reach out to us or talk to your own financial advisor. That's always a good place to start. But just to wrap things up here, the 4% rule, it is kind of the standard, the rule of thumb. And I would say that for most people, for back of the napkin math, it's a good place to start. Just like retirement projection could be a good place to start, but typically it's not a plan. It's not going to solve all your goals in retirement. So just think of it again as that starting point. If you found this strategy helpful or this video helpful, please subscribe and share it with someone who's retiring soon. Thanks, and until next time.